Hey folks, as promised, I wanted to do a quick video about introductions and about essay structure based upon the feedback you guys gave this week on the introduction workshop and the sample essay 2 exercise, okay? So I'm going to kind of just walk us through some key points here. I found it interesting, a number of you kind of glommed onto this and said it wasn't very good. Said it was personal, provided a bit of some information, but it wasn't the best. You noted that felt like the introduction was more storytelling. And Jessica noted it was problematic because it was in first person. So I want to note a couple things about this. First person is okay if there's a good reason to use it. And I think this is a good reason to use it. If we look back at sample essay 1, that introduction also uses first person, right? It piqued my interest is one of the phrases we get there. So first person isn't fundamentally problematic. The problem, Jessica notes here, or actually Dive notes here, is really that we don't get enough context, okay? So we don't know who Gander is. If we had a better understanding of what this where this article came from and why the author had read it, this might actually all work out pretty well. Context. To sort of illustrate this here, this is the one a lot of people identified as the best. And one of the reasons you guys seem to like it is because it gives us context. A common problem for many of us today is knowing if a news article is giving us the correct information. It's an issue that comes along with many popular articles we may come across in our everyday life. We continuously feel the need to question our ideas when we come across articles like Americans with PhDs are most reluctant to get vaccinated against COVID. Reading an article like this might cause the reader to question their decision to get vaccinated. Now, all of this is about identifying an issue, right? That we get this article and it might make us change our mind about something. We need to know just how accurate that article is, okay? And it's that level of context that we need to see in our introductions, right? This is ultimately what we need as readers to kind of A, get drawn in, and B, understand why this is something we want to read about. Okay, I wanted to point out this one too. Again, this was identified as one that was problematic. Did they get it right? They refers to the writers of a popular article, it being the understanding and true facts of a scholarly article. The problem here, lack of context. If you were to give this piece to someone who didn't have the assignment, they wouldn't have any idea why you were writing about this, okay? One of the goals here is to presume an audience that doesn't have the assignment, hasn't read the articles, but such that you can still give them a reason to read it, okay? And that is something that we saw in that other one. It contextualized the issue. We don't know whether or not we can trust the news. That's something that anyone, whether they've seen this assignment or not, would read and say, oh yeah, I can understand this. It totally lacks that level of context, and that's why it's really problematic. So, when it comes to introductions, think about using them to contextualize, to identify the situation that you're trying to bring your reader into, such that they have an interest in reading. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the sample essay 2. All right, let's start at the beginning here. We've got this note, of course, that there's an introduction as to who's doing the research. That's really critically important for essay 2, right? That we introduce who is doing this work. One thing that students often fault this paper for is not giving us any context before we get to this introduction of the authors, and I think that's a really reasonable critique of this piece. One or two sentences here just sort of setting out we often come across conflicting arguments about a question that we might have we might want an answer to. That would actually help us, help the reader of this piece sort of understand this, okay? I also wanted to point out the thesis here. So looking at the design of the study as well as who funded the studies, it's easy to see how the two studies came to different conclusions, even if it's hard to know who's right. So one of the things I want to point out about this is it sort of does what traditional 5-paragraph essay thesis statements do, and then it lays out what we're going to look at. It's going to look at study design, it's going to look at the funding mechanisms behind the studies. However, it doesn't come to a conclusion. One of the things we've been trained to do in our introductions is actually come to a conclusion. So we say X is the case, and then you go and try and prove that. That's what the rest of your essay does. But humans don't actually think that way. We ultimately want to be led to a reasonable conclusion. So this starts out with, it's hard to know who's right. Obviously, we expect the paper to kind of walk us through and help us try to identify that. Okay. Down here, there were some really good comments about comparing the two essays. So we get an explanation here of the difference between study designs, an explanation of how the study was done, and this nuanced explanation of the difference between weight circumference and weight gain. Okay? And down here, again, a discussion of the age. You guys all identified this as a good explanation of the differences between the studies. And one of the things we'll be looking for is that level of detail. Down here as well, we get to see that, right? Right here, we're looking into possible other causes, okay? So in this case, the author is trying to explain how an observational study can show a correlation between two things, but absolutely cannot show us causation. It's almost impossible to show causation. So we don't know why the people who drank diet soda got sort of a wider waist circumference. Also, there's a note here of like I wouldn't have thought to be noted to have looked deeply into this. Well, this is actually what we need to do with this study, with this essay, right? Is to actually get into these studies deeply enough that we can say, and this is actually a really interesting fact, right? Hill and Peters, when they did their study on diet soda, all their participants were habitual diet soda drinkers. So the people who drank water were not a control group quite so much as much as they were a group that had to quit the beverage that they were drinking. And that very much changes the outcomes. Okay? Think about this. If you were a habitual coffee drinker, in order to do a study to test the difference between coffee drinkers and non-coffee drinkers, you had to quit drinking coffee. It wouldn't actually tell us what it's like to be not a coffee drinker. It would tell us what it's like to be someone who's quitting coffee. And that's a very different test. Okay? That level of nuance, that level of detail is what we're really looking for in Essay 2. All right, so the last thing I wanted to point out here was the conclusion, okay? There are a couple interesting comments about this. Jessica notes, I usually like to see that both articles have the same answers, but here's the thing, right? Like, one of the goals here is to understand the differences between their findings and to try to understand what that tells us. Our goal here isn't to say X is the case, but to say here's what we can take away from this. The conclusion here lays out some takeaways from this. It's like, here's what each of these studies actually shows us. It doesn't show us whether or not drinking diet soda will help you lose weight, but it does show us these two particular things. Recognize that lots of your conclusions are going to, and this is something Jada notes here, stands out to me because the answer to the question wasn't given. But I agree with the sentence. Okay? Yeah, the bottom line here is there's going to be gray area. You're not necessarily going to be able to come to a conclusion that says, this is a good article, this is a bad article, or this is true, and that's false. And that's fine. That's not our job. Our job is to try to identify for the readers what the takeaway is. What can a person actually understand and know based upon these studies? It may be less than the study appears to be on the surface. And that's perfectly okay. You don't necessarily have to say, this is the case. You can come to the conclusion, well, it suggests this, but here are the things we don't know yet. And that's a completely reasonable conclusion for Essay 2. As always, if you guys have questions along the way, please don't hesitate to reach out. I am here to help.